Welcome,
That would be
everyone.
great. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Super excited. Krista, I'm just going to start by acknowledging that MSU is located in Chibuktuk, part of Mi'kma'ki, the unceded ancestral territory, which remains the homeland of the Mi'kmaq Nation. And this territory is covered by the covenant chain of treaties of peace and friendship signed between 1725 and 1779. The treaties are living agreements that establish rules for an ongoing treaty relationship between nations, and we pay respect to the knowledge embedded in the Mi'kmaq custodians of the lands and waters and of elders past, present, and future. And we also acknowledge that people of African descent have been in Nova Scotia for over 400 years and honor and offer gratitude to those ancestors of African descent who came before us to this land. And now I'm just going to ask Makwa Howe, who is a third-year student in the Bachelor of Arts program and majoring in sociology, minoring in history here at the Mount, to introduce Krista for us today.
Okay. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry. Okay. Krista Collier-Jarvis, nekm, she, her, is a member of the Mi'kmaq First Nation and a third-generation residential school survivor. She is an assistant professor in the Department of English here at MSVU, a PhD candidate at Dalhousie University, and an associate with Thinking Through the Museum. She teaches Indigenous ways of knowing and being, American literature, popular culture, and climate fiction. Her doctoral research looks at zombie narratives to develop an Indigenous-infused multi-species approach to contagion and climate change. She has recently published on Uncanny Play and Pet Cemetery and has an article in Blood Quantum forthcoming in a collection about Indigenous and Aboriginal Gothic. Krista, thank you for taking part in this series. We are all excited to hear your talk, Too Ghoul for School, Colonial Gazing, and Monstrosity, and Representing the Unrepresentable in Rhymes for Young Ghouls.
Thank you, Muga. I really appreciate that warm introduction. So Gwe Wilaliak, hello everyone. I'm really excited to be here. As Mugo mentioned, I'm Mi'kmaq, but I'm also of settler descent. So as such, having this intersectional identity, I'm often aware of the fact that I would not exist without colonization. As a result of that, I've inherited points of contact and difficult histories that are not necessarily my own lived experiences, or at least don't explicitly seem to be. So as you can see, I have titled this talk, Too Ghoul for School, Colonial Gazing, Monstrosity, and Representing the Unrepresentable in Rhymes for Young Ghouls. So today what I want to talk about are the ways in which intergenerational survivors of the residential schools inherit memory, and the ways in which we represent those inherited memories. As my case study for these ideas, I'm going to be discussing Rhymes for Young Ghouls, which is Jeff Barnaby's first Indigenous horror film. Jeff Barnaby, like myself, is also Mi'kmaq and also an intergenerational survivor. So of course, this talk is coming with a content warning. I'm going to be showing images and using some language from various readings that do use terms such as Indian that we wouldn't normally use today. But first, I do want to talk actually a little bit more about me and where I come from. So I grew up here on the border between the town of Truro and the Millbrook Mi'kmaq community. The portion circled in blue is now primarily bare land, but when I was growing up, it was actually a trailer park. So this imaginary colonial border that I've marked in green split this trailer park in two. The Truro half on the top was populated primarily by white families, and the Millbrook half was populated primarily by Mi'kmaq families. The Truro half was paved, and the Millbrook half was dirt road. And my home, which you can see in the little green dot there, where I lived with my single white mother, was positioned basically right at the center of these two. Now, in my trailer park, there was a large sense of community, but there was also a lot of violence, both from within and from without. The trailer park across from us, for instance, was burned down one day during a fight. And I remember times as a child when I woke up in the closet because fighting was so bad in the neighborhood that my mom would hide me in there. And this is because we lived in what Mary Louise Pratt might call a contact zone. Now, a contact zone is the space of colonial encounters, the space in which peoples, geographically and historically separated, come into contact with one another. According to Pratt, contact zones are social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism, slavery, or their aftermaths. So you see, the land upon which the trailer park lived was not always like this, though. I mean, it was cared for by the Mi'kmaq for thousands of years, then it was taken, and for a long time there were only white residents here. And I was a child when the res added the dirt road portion and the natives came back. However, colonial encounters of this sort didn't last long in my neighborhood. When I was 16, the town of Truro settled with Millbrook and signed the land over. All non-Indigenous families, which included my mom and my grandfather, were given a notice to vacate the land within 2 years. So luckily we made it out and my grandfather made it out, but most folks did not. They just couldn't afford to. So those who remained were given a very, very, very small cash settlement and kicked off the land. Then over the years, as the place remained vacant, the land slowly took back the empty trailers until someone finally came in the night and burned the rest of those trailers to the ground. So I refer to this as a kind of land back movement, but it did not feel like reconciliation. So you might be asking what this has to do with the residential schools. Perhaps nothing, and perhaps everything. My Nugami, that's grandmother in Mi'kmaq, Mary Gladys Bernard, was a survivor of the Shubenacadie Residential School. The school operated between 1930 and 1967 here in Nova Scotia. Because it was the only residential school in the Maritimes, it housed Indigenous children from across the region. And like most residential schools in Canada, the Shubenacadie School was a government-sponsored, church-run institution. And in total, there were approximately 130 of these schools across Canada, with the last one closing as recently as 1996. The schools were governed by the Indian Act, which made attendance mandatory until 1948. However, even without mandatory attendance, for various reasons, many Indigenous families did not feel they had any other choice but to send their children to the schools. So in total, approximately 150,000 Indigenous children across what we call Canada were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in these schools. Now, conditions were, of course, despicable. The schools were often overcrowded with poor sanitation. They had very little medical care. There was a lot of inadequate heating in some of these schools. And as a result of this, the children often suffered malnourishment, physical abuse, sexual abuse, sickness, and, as we know, death. For those who did survive, at the age of 16, they were released from the school, often with only an elementary level education and the address of the nearest welfare office. And having spent most of their youth within these schools, the children lost their families, their community ties, their cultures, and their languages. So the residential schools were sites of cultural genocide with the explicit goal of assimilating Indigenous children into Canadian society, or what we might call to kill the Indian in the child. So many of you have probably heard this statement before. It's typically attributed to Duncan Campbell Scott, who is a Canadian Confederate poet, who also served as the Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs between 1913 and 1932. Now, Scott was an avid supporter of Canada's assimilation policies. However, this phrase, to kill the Indian and the child, is incorrectly attributed to him. It was actually an unnamed American military officer who said these words. Regardless of that, though, Scott did amend the Indian Act, which made attendance mandatory, and he publicly stated, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem." Now, on top of this, his poetry became a further embodiment of his assimilationist ideology, championing the myth of the vanishing Indian. In his 1898 poem, The Onondaga Madonna, for example, he referred to Indigenous people as a weird and waning race of tragic savages. So even if we can't trace exactly where or from whom these words, to kill the Indian and the child, emerged, they have come to embody for us the essence of the Canadian Indian residential school system. Brianne Young rightly argues that the mandate is a biopolitical tool that is paradoxical in nature, where, as she states, a kind of simultaneous survival and annihilation is called into co-being. The suggestion within this mandate is that the so-called child and the so-called Indian cannot be left to coexist in one body. They are two disparate entities that can somehow be separated, extracting one without presumably damaging the other. And the recent confirmations of unmarked graves at the former sites of these schools speaks not only to the brutality of what happened in them, but to the continued silencing of the children's stories and the continued control of their bodies, even in death, by the Canadian government. The covering up of these graves is a biopolitical tool that functioned as an extension of the schools themselves. So, Manukami didn't talk about the schools, but she did speak Mi'kmaq until the day she died. My father didn't go to the schools at all, but he refused to speak Mi'kmaq despite being fluent in it. My grandmother was a very sweet, gentle woman, but my father was a very violent man. And while many studies have been done on the generational impacts of the schools, it's kind of impossible for us in our day-to-day lived experience to tease out which of these things are directly caused by, correlated with, or have absolutely nothing to do with the schools. The question becomes, is violence in general often an extension of the biopolitics of killing the Indian and the child? So in my search for understanding my lived experiences in the trailer park in relation to inherited traumas and histories, my research questions how different intergenerational survivors represent them. But, and here's a caution here, there are many potential ethical qualms in pursuing this line of inquiry. In her work on post-memory in the Holocaust, Marianne Hirsch poses quite a few complicated ethical questions about being an intergenerational survivor that personally plague me as well. Hirsch asks whether we owe our families and communities anything to begin with. For example, if I do speak about my history and I mention my indigeneity or my survivorship status as I'm doing here today, am I positioning myself as some sort of authority on this topic? Am I appropriating an identity that isn't actually mine? Am I, in the process, potentially silencing my own story and lived experiences in the search for understanding those of my ancestors? Manukami isn't here to tell her story, for example, and in fact, when she was here, she didn't seem inclined to do so. So do I have a right to speak to her silence? And if I do, will I be ostracized by my community in the process? While telling stories can help us to make sense of ourselves, do we unwittingly fictionalize or misrepresent the past? And as a result of that, things like the narrative impulse can often alter memory. Or in restructuring or making sense of my identity in terms of intergenerational survivorship, do I begin to perform the practices that constitute this identity? As you can see, I have way more questions than answers. And it seems there is a lot of potential here to do damage or become damaged by the process of seeking answers. So really, what do we do? Is there more damage in being silent? Well, I want to propose here kind of a more interconnected model for understanding residential schools and their potential aftermaths. And this one is predicated on an Indigenous approach to knowledge put forth by Dwayne Donald. He calls it Indigenous métissage, and it calls for braiding stories. So according to Donald, instead of having one story being like the story about residential schools, that story is just one strand. When you take several stories or strands and you begin to braid them together, you have a much broader understanding of something. So I'm proposing a braiding of intergenerational voices here. And I want to begin with two primary forms in which these firsthand experiences of the residential schools exist. I want to make sure, of course, that the first thing we do is listen to the voices of the survivors. And they've given us the memoir. As the term suggests, memoirs are snippets of memory that typically come in literary form and are often accompanied by photographs. These are non-fiction accounts written by survivors who went to the schools, and they have much to teach us. Memoirs are essentially textual witnessing, but they rely on memory writing, and memory is a particularly interesting thing. Adrienne Kurtzer, for example, is a second-generation Holocaust survivor who, like other intergenerational Holocaust survivors, spends much time with the concept of the double self. Kurtzer argues that even the survivor often admits that what she witnessed in the death camps was witnessed by a different self, and only that self understands. Because the experience changes the survivor, the one who witnesses is not the same as the one who writes the memoir. And this becomes even more complicated by the fact that in residential schools, the witness is a child who is in the process of losing their Indigenous language and culture, and the survivor becomes a more colonized adult who may only be able to speak English. And let me just be really clear here. I don't want to discount memoirs in any way, just to highlight how forms of memory writing often have significant limitations. And this leads me to a central question I have in this research is, where are the residential school diaries? In contrast to memoirs, which rely on a process of memory recall, diaries are written in real time when the experience is occurring. And I do welcome anyone who has found any residential school diaries, because my research keeps coming up empty. I found fictional diaries about the residential schools, and that's a whole different conversation, but no genuine ones written by the survivors. So the only real-time documentation we're left with are these tiny black and white photographs. Now, to me, they look eerily like my own non-residential school educational experience. Photographs, especially those posed within the classrooms, evoke a narrative associated with the supposedly educational program at the schools, as does our continuance to refer to them as such, in a way that functions as congealed ideology. And what this means is that those who stage and photograph the moment control the narrative, and all signifiers within these images, such as the desks, the teachers, the drab bare walls, the uniforms, and so on, these congeal the ideology that the schools are supposedly just educational institutions. Hence the reason why these images don't feel so distant from our own Canadian childhood educational experiences. As such, we tend to layer what our educational experiences signify on top of these photographs in a way that can possibly downplay the horror of the residential school experience. These images were not created by survivors, and they lack what John Boyne, the author of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, calls emotional truth. So if we return to Kurtzer for a moment, we might see that those who survive are not those who are pictured here in their tidy school desks. Therefore, there is no real witness here, even in the photographs. So by extension, no real account of the traumatic residential school experience. What we are left with is something called the unrepresentable. In light of something that is already unrepresentable, we can't just leave it silent though. Liesel, the protagonist in Marcus Zuzak's 2005 Holocaust children's novel, The Book Thief, tells us that ultimately it didn't matter what the book was about, it was what it meant that was more important. So while intergenerational survivors are left with the impossible and yes, sometimes problematic task of representing this unrepresentable thing, we must still speak up. Young argues that colonial memory ensures the stories of the children who entered the residential school system never fully enter into signification, meaning they always already resist being represented. And if we are to believe Young, this resistance is part of the colonial program, so it therefore also becomes transmitted as part of intergenerational trauma and memory. So I have inherited the unrepresentable. But the first time I encountered those tiny black and white photographs was also the first time in which I encountered the work of Cree artist Kent Monkman, including his 2017 painting, The Scream. So Monkman's painting depicts Catholic priests and nuns, as well as RCMP officers, tearing Indigenous children away from their mothers. Monkman's oeuvre is often characterized by references to famous European works, and this one takes its name, of course, from Norwegian artist Edvard Munch's 1893 painting of the same name. As such, it simultaneously borrows everything signified by Munch's painting, such as trauma, melancholy, and alienation, and it brings those into this painting. In this manner, by borrowing the title and signification of Munch's work, Monkman also borrows a different way to represent residential school trauma. This becomes a method of representing the unrepresentable. Monkman admits, Museums across the continent hold in their collections countless paintings that depict and celebrate the European settlers' expansion and discovery of the North American landscape, but very few, if any, show the dispossession and removal of the first peoples from their lands. So by referencing European work, Monkman adds the Indigenous voice to the history, not just of Turtle Island, but the history of Europe more broadly. And by employing this method, Monkman is pointing out how the legacy of those works of art is built upon the silencing of Indigenous peoples. So this painting, which is originally 7 by 11 feet, makes us feel quite small when we stand in front of it. And this is often how we feel next to such enormous iniquity as the legacy of the schools. With its colorful palette, it makes us feel much too present in this moment of atrocity. The color personally makes me uncomfortable because it's at odds with what it represents. The color essentially unsettles us in the manner that decolonial praxis states we should feel. Therefore, the aesthetics are designed to embody and evoke some affect associated with the residential school experience and methods of decolonizing the viewer. When we gaze upon the screen, we thus become witnesses not necessarily to an actual moment in history, but to Monkman's legacy as an intergenerational survivor. Like me, Monkman's nekm survived the schools, and in fact, he dedicated this painting to her. But what I find particularly interesting about this painting is that all gazes in and upon the screen, including ours, essentially become oriented and reoriented upon the body of a child. So, for example, if we take a moment and look into the eyes of the first subject that might catch our attention, we likely see the 2 RCMP officers who are positioned front and center, or the distressed Indigenous mother to which those 2 officers are clinging. She's adorned in blue, frantically reaching out for her child. If we follow the gazes of any of these figures, we look directly at the child that the priest lugs away. And nearly every gaze in this painting converges upon the body of a child. And as onlookers, we might feel ashamed at this process, and we most likely will look away. So part of the severing of our gaze comes from our inability to be hailed by the child. We cannot identify with them. And part of it resides in the realization that what we are essentially reifying in this process is a colonial gaze. And this makes us, the viewers, culpable and perhaps even collaborators and co-conspirators in this process. Young calls the signification and display of the child's body as abject, as spectacle, as there to be seen, as being captive to a penetrating and colonizing gaze that goes on and on. According to Megan Lewis, the colonial gaze is when Indigenous bodies are framed by their European exhibitors as strange, unfamiliar, and exotic, and were imagined as dehumanized objects to be gazed upon with wonder, disgust, lust, and scientific curiosity. Not unlike the monster, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. Gazes tend to reinforce dynamics of power, and the partially exposed bodies of the children here ensure they are vulnerable and the mothers are rendered powerless. When Monkman gives us the screen, he provides another way of looking at the history of the residential schools. This depiction and how it makes us feel cannot be captured in those tiny black and white photographs. It carries the emotional truth that Monkman inherited and therefore becomes absorbed into post-memory. It is his way of representing the unrepresentable. It's another strand in the story, and while it reifies some aspects of the colonial gaze, it also provides us the opportunity to interrupt it. So for example, instead of merely feeling shame and looking away from the painting, let's instead look away from the child and look back at the distraught mothers. If we take a moment and identify with their pain, when we're ready, we can look back upon the colonizers, those priests and nuns and our CMP officers, and we can dismantle their hegemonic power by reversing the colonial gaze. And while motion in Monkman's painting is signified in a number of ways here, we have the birds caught mid-flight, the priest crosses leaning away from their bodies, and the wisps of hair that trail behind their owners, the subjects themselves are caught forever in this moment in time. Young refers to representations such as these, narrative fragments that belong to the historiography associated only with death. And this is all we really have, just fragments of memories. So not only with the problematics of representing trauma more broadly, but paintings such as the screen carry the potential to fill some of the gaps and give us a glimpse of what hasn't been represented yet. In doing so, they expand historiography beyond death. So yes, while I do agree with Young's analysis that the association with the death is undeniable, and frozen narrative fragments such as this are traumatic and gut-wrenching, these children are not vanished. These children are not dead. And in fact, because this moment occurs before they have officially been brought to the schools, it defies and precedes and resists the loss associated with the schools. And I argue this is also the case with Roddenberry and Ghouls. So the late Jeff Barnaby was also an intergenerational survivor, but he never really intended to make a film about residential schools. However, this is exactly what Roddenberry and Ghouls becomes. So the film came out in 2013, but it begins in 1969 on the fictional Red Crow Indian Reservation, where Ayla's mother, intoxicated, accidentally drives over her little brother Tyler, killing him, and then she hangs herself. Ayla's father, Joseph, takes responsibility for Tyler's death and is sent to jail. The rest of the film takes place 7 years later and follows 15-year-old Mi'kmaq protagonist Ayla when her father is released from prison and returns to the res, only to find that his daughter has become a drug dealer to pay an under-the-table truancy tax to the local Indian agent, Popper. In exchange, Ayla does not have to attend St. D's residential school. However, when a raid results in her drug money being confiscated, Ayla is forcibly taken into the school. Jujish, who is a rather mysterious little boy character, helps her escape, and Ayla, along with her friends, hatch out a plan to break into St. D's to retrieve their money. Ultimately, the film ends with them succeeding, but when Popper comes to confront Ayla and tries to rape her, Jujish shoots and kills him, and Ayla's father, who is blamed for Popper's death, returns to jail. So this film is fraught with gothic ghouls, hence the title, such as ghosts, skeletons, zombies, and so on, and the settings are dark and ominous with very limited lighting. The colonial gaze is most prominent when Ayla is taken into the school. We watch her stripped of her clothing and her hair, and we see her placed in a prime position for gazing, naked and powerless in a bathtub. Ayla has no agency here, and her power to partake in gazing herself is removed as she first looks down, and then her eyes disappear entirely from the scene. While Young argues that reciting racialized injury and practices of bodily subjection such as this can reinscribe hegemonic reformations of domination and power that made these practices possible in the first place, I argue that Ayla resists these hegemonic reformations later in the film when she becomes a ghoul. In the opening scene, St. D's residential school sits atop a hill in the background. Its position suggests that it looms over the res as a kind of all-seeing eye whose inhabitants remain unseen and may or may not be watching at all times. This is an embodiment of the colonial gaze. St. D's stands out in the background as the only thing lit. It does not appear to explicitly generate its own light, as no lights seem to be attached to the building itself, but rather some unseen source is directed at the school to make it glow, and thus its policed subjects cannot possibly ignore its presence. Like Michel Foucault's panopticon, the position of St. D's residential school suggests a form of asymmetrical surveillance, whereby institutions deploy disciplinary subjugation upon its citizens through internalized social control. I'm using the term surveillance very broadly here to refer to systems designed and wielded by colonial institutions and their representatives with the goal of regulating the bodies and behaviors of Indigenous children. The camera angles in the film, for instance, are always positioned in a low tilt looking up at the school, and the surveillant who inhabits the school is on scene during each of these moments. And as such, the entire architecture of the building begins to embody them. As Foucault states, he, which in Foucault's original case would be the prisoner, is seen, but he does not see. He is an object of information, never a subject in communication. As such, the bodies presided over by the gaze of the panoptic school structure are reduced to objects that do not have voices. They cannot speak back to the school. During this opening scene, under the watchfulness of St. Dee's, Uncle Bernard tells Ayla and Tyler that the school is habited by a zombie priest who cooks Indian kids. Bernard goes on to claim that normal zombies just eat anyone, but these so-called religified zombies, they throw the kids down this hole to the cooker. In reality, this is a bedtime story told to the Mi'kmaq children in the film to explain why so many of them have gone missing from the res. But the invocation of the zombie here becomes the locus of a larger colonial program of assimilation into the white Christian milieu. The zombie, after all, is the ultimate metaphor for the erasure of individuality and agency. Popper, as the zombie priest, thus threatens to assimilate the Indigenous children within St. Dee's through his embodiment of the zombie metaphor. The so-called zombie priest sucks the life from the Indigenous children residing within the school's walls, and through the colonial program of killing the Indian and the child, he transforms these Indigenous children into his own image. So, figured as monster, the zombie priest can freely traverse the corridors of St. Dee's. Monstrosity therefore becomes synonymous with inhabiting the space of the residential school. Ken Derry refers to Popper as a so-called real monster. Drawing on some ideas put forth by Guillermo del Toro, Derry claims, real monsters are people entrusted to positions of authority who pretend to be good, wise, and helpful, whose seemingly ordinary appearance, he suggests, masks their underlying deadliness. However, monsters and monstrosity within the film are not merely tools for cultural genocide, but can be figured out as methods of resistance as well. And these would be our ghouls. While the residential school system was predicated on a kind of colonial gazing that dehumanized, policed, and assimilated Indigenous bodies, in Rhymes, monstrosity is wielded by the Indigenous characters as a tool of resistance. By embodying monstrosity willingly, the Indigenous characters can both subvert and move through the colonial gaze, disrupting its surveillance. The term ghoul can be applied broadly throughout the film to refer to a variety of monstrous figures, such as Ayla in her gas mask, depicted in the center in this scene, as well as her friends who dress in various Halloween costumes. Etymologically, the term originated in the early 18th century in Arabic folklore, referring to wandering demons who inhabit lonely and deserted places and who consume human flesh. Now, more recent uses of the term still focus on a penchant for consuming human flesh, and they often collapse distinctions between ghouls and zombies, such as George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. But more specifically, the ghoul is a figure of grotesque and bestial qualities, such as the skeleton and the rabbit pictured here. Unlike the use of masks to hide monstrosity that is essential to the so-called real monsters, they look human but are monstrous underneath. Derry's false monster is the ghoul, who's monstrous on the outside. Derry posits that the false monsters are the outcasts, and he notes that those who are vilified and often brutalized because they do not conform to social expectations of appearance, ability, or behavior. In this manner, the ghoul, if we adopt Derry's concept of false monstrosity, can freely enter, but more importantly, willingly leave the schools precisely because they resist conformity. Ayla and her friends embody a false monstrosity in the film when they adopt these ghoulish costumes and they break into St. Dee's. So, unfortunately, while they do get caught, they also successfully escape. In part, this is due to the monster's penchant for resisting classification. The assimilationist program of Popper and the school relies upon easy ordering. But in his monster theory, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen tells us that the monster is the harbinger of category crisis, noting how the monster always escapes because it refuses easy categorization. Similarly, Harvey Greenberg claims that monsters are Linnaean nightmares, defying every natural law of evolution. So Ayla and her friends are neither human nor animal, neither dead nor alive. Their costumes position their bodies beneath layers of dissonant skins resisting easy suturing. They are, as Cohen might say, disturbing hybrids whose incoherent bodies resist attempts to include them in any systematic structuration. So, as a system of order, the residential school program does not know how to assimilate these bodies into its tidy rows of preying zombie children. So their ghoulishness becomes a point of resistance. These ghouls transgress and disrupt binaries and other forms of classification that constitute colonial surveillance. As such, Joshua Miner argues that ghoulish indigenous bodies in rhymes are part of the aesthetic strategy that deconstructs the categories and discourses of ethnographic supervision. In this manner, when indigenous bodies in the film enter into ghoulishness, they defy ethnographic surveillance. Ayla's monstrosity allows her and her friends to pass freely through the doorways and hallways of the school, just as it does for Popper and those who work at the school. Therefore, the ghouls haunt the very spaces that produce undead indigenous children. But they also confront the schools directly by defying its order and therefore draw on ghoulishness as an ongoing strategy of resistance. This is also apparent in the single animated scene in the film. At one point, Ayla's surrogate Nugami, Ceres, tells her the story of the wolf and the mushroom, whereby a wolf is so hungry that it begins to hallucinate, and thus it sees the dead Mi'kmaq children hanging from a tree as if they were mushrooms. After consuming them, he is overcome with guilt and continues to consume until finally he consumes himself. According to Taylor Sanchez Guzman, the use of animation to tell the story of the wolf challenges static representations of indigenous cultural traditions and ways of life as solely enabled through the biopolitics of settlement. And this is because animation does not appear elsewhere in the film. So it interrupts not only the live action, but also the biological aspects of the characters. The mechanical imagery that the wolf is made from is a byproduct of industry, most likely associated with a similar kind of so-called progress that is the civilizing of indigenous populations, one of the driving factors behind the school system more broadly. So the wolf becomes a kind of technological monster that, like the zombie priest, is overpowered by its consumption of children. But unlike the zombie priest, the wolf feels guilty for its actions. In this way, technological monstrosity is a form of resistance against the colonial program, as the wolf ultimately eats itself and thereby effaces the very perpetration of consumption. But ghouls also exert resistance by appearing to Ayla in her dreams. Throughout the film, Ayla has visions of both her deceased mother and brother, but they appear as the undead. Her brother appears to her when she is placed in solitary confinement. So this undead Tyler unfortunately seems to be a product of the school's assimilationist program, even though he never perished within the schools himself. As such, the film seems to suggest that the trauma of the residential school program is not confined within the walls of the building, but extends outward and onto the res, and is partly responsible for the events that lead to Tyler's death. During one dream scene, undead Tyler silently leads Ayla out of her cell into the forest to a pit filled with children's bodies. And I'm going to show that image, and I just want to take a moment to reiterate my content warning here because I find it a particularly disturbing image. So Ayla stands at the edge of a pit, dressed in white robes. But here she is still adorned with her long hair, suggesting that the significance of long hair for Indigenous peoples is not solely external, but can exist within the self as a kind of resilience. But the position of her hair also transforms her white robes into something that looks uncannily like a priest's garment. And thus, when Ayla gazes down at the bodies in the pit, she is positioned as a colonial surveillant. But her act of witnessing becomes a form of reclamation in this moment, because she can finally bring this witnessing back to her community and account for the missing children. She's given the power of the colonial gaze, but I want to argue that in a sense, she decolonizes it. Now, this film came out long before the recent confirmations of unmarked graves. But as Young tells us, signifiers are always and already sliding along a chain of signification that is never truly fixed. So this pit gives us a visual representation of the faceless, nameless residential school victims more broadly. In this manner, Ayla embodies the double self, which Roma Sendica explains as life lived for the living and life lived for the absent, for the children left in the pit, for her spectral brother, and for the very real lost children that might still be lying in the unmarked graves at the sites of former schools and have yet to tell us their stories. So when Ayla reawakens in her cell, Tyler disappears and the door opens to reveal Jujish, who apologizes for taking so long. Earlier, I mentioned that Jujish is a rather mysterious character, and this is because we don't learn much about him. It is unclear what his relationship is to the other characters in the film. I have argued elsewhere that Jujish is a spectral figure meant to represent Tyler. While the two characters are played by different actors, the fact that they are similar in age, they look quite similar, they're layered in this scene. When one disappears, the other appears. And Jujish's name all kind of suggest a close connection between these two. Jujish is the only character in the film whose name is a Mi'kmaq word, and it means little bug. In Mi'kmaq communities, this is often not used as a name, but rather as a term of endearment for children. I therefore read Jujish as a ghoul, and this becomes most prominent when we find out that Jujish can freely enter and exit the school whenever he wants. When Ayla leaves the cell, her voiceover states, "I wonder how many ghosts wander around down in this hole, or how many got out that were ruined all the same," which is Ayla's acknowledgement of her double self. Meanwhile, the light shining back through the crack in the door that she leaves open reflects onto the wall of the cell, revealing 7 ghost-like figures that possibly represent the children lost in the school. In this manner, the shining light that originally lit the school upon the hill now shines upon the little ghost-like bodies of the children lost within the school. Like the bodies of the children in the pit, Ayla's time in confinement means that she has witnessed the ghosts, and through her witnessing, they might finally have a way out, now that Ayla has subverted the colonial gaze and redirected the shining light. Ayla's experience within the school is one that reclaims Mi'kmaq children, their bodies and their stories, allowing them to enter into signification. She essentially saves the child within the Indian. In conclusion, while representations such as Monkman's painting and Barnaby's film produce meaning, they can never fully invoke the experience of the thing they purport to represent. We still need memoirs for that. What's happening in these more fictionalized narratives is that the representation is not wholly divorced from the reality, but rather it implicates reality in a complex enmeshment. Young argues that individualized representations are arrested between the singular and the plural, where a part stands in for the whole. Therefore, each story is both an individual and a collective representation of the residential school experience, and we can breed these together. While problems can arise from attempting to represent these events, the victims and the survivors, Germaine Necker-de states that if representation touches our hearts, it can have a great influence on our moral ideas. And this is really what we need right now. We need to acknowledge our implication in various legacies, such as the schools, even if we're not intergenerational survivors. So in the end, fictionalized narratives by intergenerational survivors demonstrate that we can represent the unrepresentable, and that monstrosity can be a point of resistance. Ayla, after all, reveals that she was just too cool for school. Wilaliak, thank you.